So this is our first PowerPoint that I want to walk you through, and I want to warn you that just for this first episode, the material does seem to go a little bit long, and that's because I wanted to give you some good introductory material to help you build a foundation. I didn't just want you to learn the theories of composition, I also wanted you to learn about theory itself. So you're going to see some material that helps set this whole class up. And I thought about putting that material in the orientation unit, which is that very first Start Here folder. But the reason I didn't is because I wanted that to be about us getting to know one another. And so I've attached that material to this presentation, and I will try my best not to make it go too long. One of the things that can be a problem in online classes is the size of any given file at any given time. And the larger the file, the harder it is for some people to play or download. So we'll try to keep this very streamlined. So the first thing I think it's important for us to do is to come up with a definition of what theory is. One of the biggest challenges in scholarship is to come up with definitions that we are clear and articulate about. Often we assume that everybody defines a certain word the same way, and those assumptions can be dangerous. So what I want to do is tell you the definition of theory that I truly think works and share it with you before we even get started. And it's by Sharon Crowley. She says, in Aristotle's Greek, the verb theorin means to observe from afar. It refers to someone sitting at the top row of the theater. A theorist is the spectator who is the most distant from the scene on stage and whose body is in one sense the least involved, but who nonetheless is affected by it. The implication is that while theory lacks the immediacy of practice, its distance permits a wider ranging view. Okay, and so this is the definition that I'll be operating from, and I hope it's one that works for you as well. This idea of theory being a practice that helps us remove ourselves or stand back from the day-to-day and really think about how we do what we do. So who are theorists? Well, honestly, most of us, when we think of someone who specializes in theory, we tend to think of someone who's a little bit of a snob, right? They're always inside their heads. They're dealing in abstract concepts. And one image that always comes to mind for me is this image of an art gallery where people want to appear smart, so they step back from the painting, far enough, and they frown and they scratch their chins and they look like they're concentrating. In other words, anytime I imagine a theorist, that's what I imagine is a person trying to look intelligent in an art gallery. Well, there is some truth to that. There are theorists who are hard to understand, that don't have good social skills, that live only inside their heads with very difficult concepts that they're trying to master. But theory can also guide day-to-day people. But we have to be careful to figure out how to do that because theory can seem very far removed from the public. We don't want to act like people walking around an art gallery who are better than anybody else just because we know the theory. We want theory to help us step back and look at ourselves. So one of the stereotypes you may think of when you consider theorists themselves is this stereotype of a character from The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper. And Sheldon Cooper is a theoretical physicist. Theoretical, not a practicing physicist, a theoretical one. And while science is very different from composition, the principles of what theory does are basically the same. And what we see here is that Sheldon is giving a rather superior look to his friends, just like we might imagine the theorist doing. And he's working on really complicated stuff on that whiteboard, which I don't know about you, but I don't understand a thing that's on that board. And so that's one of the images of a theorist that we see in pop culture. That said, even Sheldon believes that there are limits to what he does, and I'll show you a clip of that in just a moment. So the main challenge about theory. People assume that theory and practice are often separate. And by practice, we mean the stuff we do in the day-to-day world. Okay? So if I'm a teacher of writing, I may believe that my experience and my practice are really the only thing that's important. I don't need a theory. I just need to be able to get experience in the classroom. And experience is a good thing, especially because theory can sometimes seem impractical. Theory sometimes complicates stuff. It makes stuff even more academic and more removed from the general public, and that can offend and even alienate people. In fact, Sheldon says this very thing at one point when he's having a crisis about his own field. I'm going to show you this video where he talks about how theory has become too abstract even for him.
I gotta tell you, the more I read about the primordial gravity wave discovery, the more excited I get.
I know, being an astrophysicist right now is like being a rock star. Only without the sex. Yeah, literally none of it.
What do you think about it, Sheldon?
Meh. Are you kidding me? This may be the biggest scientific breakthrough of our lifetime. How can you, as a theoretical physicist, not care about this?
Maybe it's because I'm not an elitist. Yeah, what I'd like to know is, how does this gravity wave breakthrough help the man on the street, you know? Who's looking out for Joe's six-pack and all his quantum physics concerns?
Oh my God, you're jealous.
Why would I be jealous?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe because the origin of the universe just got proven. The Higgs field just got proven, and you've been working on string theory for the last 20 years, and you're no closer to proving it than when you started.
Yeah, well, I've had a lot on my plate. We happen to live in a golden age of television.
Excuse me, fellas. Sorry for eavesdropping, but there actually was some big string theory news today out of the Hadron Collider.
So one of the things I want to notice with you is this idea that even Sheldon has noticed that theory only goes so far. And as a result, he is making a statement that sounds like he wants to retire from the field. He basically says, you know, what is theory doing for the average person on the street? Now, we find out later that Sheldon is acting sad for reasons that aren't quite so straightforward, but anyway, his complaint that he makes is actually a complaint that many people make about theory. It's too hard. It has nothing to do with daily experience. It's incredibly intellectual and sometimes removed from reality. These are all complaints that can be valid. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is that theory can be very challenging to read, and I'm not going to lie to you on that. Some of the readings you'll do are not going to be simple. And Mike Bunn, who wrote How to Read Like a Writer, he tells us that when we face some dense readings, it's important that readers learn to think like architects. So my advice to you is to focus on how the theory is structured and why. Where is the thesis statement? What are the major points? Don't obsess over any one difficult sentence. Just keep moving. Focus on the forest, the big picture, and not the trees when you get stuck. All I ask of you is that when you hit a difficult passage, that you don't just quit. We can't really get anywhere if you give up. But I promise that everyone, even PhDs, even the most experienced philosophers and professors in the world, struggle with difficult passages of theory. You are not alone. In fact, it's normal to find difficult passages and say, wow, what the heck is that person talking about? Let me just skip to the next paragraph. And maybe draw yourself a question mark next to that paragraph and use the wiki, as it says below, to ask me questions about what the passages are saying. We're going to use the wiki as a very informal space where people can ask those kinds of questions. I want you also to keep the major goals in mind. Sometimes we get bogged down in details, and the 4 things that are most important in this class, these 4 things are what you always want to return to. We're going to gain a new perspective on ideas about writing that we take for granted. We're going to understand how crosstalk takes place among scholars, and we're going to identify major trends in the history of the field of composition studies and analyze the role that theory plays in our lives. And like we're doing now, we're going to look at its value and its limitations. One of the things that helps before we dive into the first set of readings is to think about how all of this conversation got started. Okay, when did people start thinking about writing and how it happens and how to make it better and how to teach it? We often date the first time people started thinking about comp theory as the 1880s because at Harvard, some of the professors at that time, They were complaining that their students made embarrassing mistakes in their English, and they wanted to correct the issue. Sound familiar? Well, what you need to realize is that for centuries, the older generations have complained about the younger generations. They will often call them illiterate or lazy or, well, back when I did things, they were better, that kind of feeling. This is not unique to our time now. I know that you've probably heard people complain about how students today don't know how to write because they use all those stupid emojis and they write like they're texting. Well, guess what? That complaint has gone back forever since the beginning of time. Even in ancient Rome, the emperor has been known to complain that his grandson is not very smart and has become lazy in the way that he writes and interprets poetry. Even back to Plato, Plato said that if we learn to write, we're actually going to become lazy because we'll stop using our memories. So this argument is an old one. It is not new to texting. And one of the things that happened from the 1890s to roughly the 1950s was, in order to correct these problems at Harvard and elsewhere, people began to focus on mechanical correctness and mastery of written language of English. Students stopped studying the classics like Greek and Latin, so the oral performances were replaced by written exams and written essays. And so, a quick note about this. Before the 1880s and 1890s, students were, we could call them multilingual because they were learning Latin, they were learning Greek, and they were learning Common English. And English was known as the common tongue. But then when the classics started to dwindle and people weren't studying them anymore, English got all of the attention. And when it got all of the attention, a lot of errors and concerns came out. So what happened then was that writing instruction and writing teachers used handbooks, and these handbooks would emphasize the rules of grammar. These handbooks would include things like diagramming sentences. Teachers would collect daily essays in class, and they would ask the students basically to practice mastering the rules in the handbooks. There wasn't a lot of creativity, and there wasn't a lot of leeway for coming up with your own ideas. You basically followed the handbook. So there was a problem with that. Conditions for writing teachers started to decline. And the reason was that if the handbook was so great, people started assuming that anybody could teach the writing classes, right? All you needed is the right handbook. So composition was seen as remedial and basic. And it was a place then dominated by a lot of women, and many were part-time teachers and assistants or graduate assistants to teachers. College students during this time were often white middle-class men, but things began to change when the GI Bill was introduced. Basically, after World War II, veterans of different cultures, races, classes, and abilities began to enroll in America's colleges. And narrow English-only rule-based curriculums were difficult for many students, although some teachers did find creative ways to reach them, like asking them to write about their neighborhoods or conduct local research. Not all writing instruction was purely rule-based, but most of it was. And for people who were not raised in a classic traditional school, this was very difficult. And one of the worst parts was that the error on the page often equaled the error of the student's brain. In other words, if you made mistakes on your writing, it meant that you as a person were flawed. And this made classes a very negative experience for a lot of students. Many students were called illiterate, even though they were not illiterate at all. They were simply pegged that way because of some of the mistakes they were making. The process theorists come along at this time, and they encourage us to focus on the writer and not the errors. The writer's ideas are the most important, especially in early drafts of the work. Well, the word draft, what on earth was that? The handbooks didn't talk about what a draft was. Well, the idea is, in 1966 at the Dartmouth Conference, the British and American teachers got together, and they talked about the state of writing. And one of the things the British told us was that we need to focus on student development, not mastery. Not just a student product, not just the final essay. We need to focus on the things that go on before they turn in the essay. What is the student learning? And in order to do this, teachers began to do a really cool thing. They began to reflect on how they handled their own writing. One of the famous books by the process theorists is Don Murray's book called A Writer Teaches Writing, and he wrote it in 1968. And this is an important book because one of the things that Don Murray did is he wrote daily, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. And instead of acting like he was better than his students, he treated them like a writer as they walked in the door. In other words, by choosing to believe that students have something important to say, we can call them writers from the very first day, not just when they master grammatical concepts. So one of the ways to help students get over their fear of writing was to engage in something called free writing, as described by Ken McCrory and Peter Elbow, both of whom you'll read in this unit. It's one way to help students break through the fear of the blank page because students would write non-stop without editing and then take their free writes and build more ideas from them. A free writing activity may have been done in your own classroom growing up. Some of McCrory and Elbow's ideas have trickled down over the decades. So maybe your teacher at one point in one of your classes said to you, okay, get out a pen, get out a piece of paper, and just simply keep your hands moving and writing for 5 minutes. Don't stop no matter what. Well, that activity was called free writing, and they may not have used that term, but it's essentially what it was. The idea is that writing has to happen in stages. It's not going to be correct and perfect right away. And the process theorists began to see that we needed to teach students the 3 stages, the 3 main stages of writing, which are pre-writing, like the free writing exercise, the writing itself, which is more serious and a little more governed and a little more focused, and then the final stage where we worry about the grammatical rules, which is the revising. We don't worry about proofreading or picking up our handbook until we get to the end. So the writing class, if it's governed this way, could be handled like a workshop. And in this workshop, people would share their early drafts with one another before perfecting the results. One name for the process theorists is called, quote, the expressivists. However, you need to know that this name has some baggage. I bring this up because my own mentor in my PhD program did not like this word, and he considers himself part of the process movement. People sometimes thought and still think that process theorists don't focus enough. They don't get their students to write disciplined and accurate information. They simply get their students in a circle and tell them to write down their individual feelings and share them. In other words, when we think of the process theorists, some people like to imagine a group of people around a campfire singing Kumbaya to each other. This is not accurate. Just because there were stages and processes involved did not mean that the process itself wasn't disciplined. One other problem was that Elbow, Peter Elbow, whom you'll read in the attached document in Blackboard, he had this idea that the first thing we want to do when we read a writer's work is believe what they are saying. We don't want to doubt it, we want to believe in it. Well, people distorted that idea. They thought that that meant he was being lenient or easy on his students. No, Elbow tells us that believing actually takes a lot more work than doubting, and you'll read about that. That believing takes a lot of cognitive effort. So now I want you to go to your assigned readings for episode 1, which is on process theory, and you'll be reading Donald Murray, Peter Elbow, and Ken McCrory, all of the people that were mentioned in this demonstration here. And then after you read, I want you to post to the discussion board and later respond to 2 posts that you see there. I have posted the guidelines for discussion boards and wikis up on Blackboard. One of the last things I want to say is that there are some resources on composition history that you might want to explore. I would recommend these 2 sites. There is one that operates a little bit like a wiki or a Wikipedia entry, which is the macmillanlearning.com site. And this other site is for some of you who might be considering PhD work in composition. Rebecca Moore Howard has gathered a very extensive bibliography on histories of the field, and it's fascinating stuff. Some of it's books that you would have to take out on interlibrary loan, but some of the articles can be found through JSTOR. Good luck with everything, and let me know if you have questions.